Hello, I'm Darius, and today we'll be talking about documentation. Either you love it or you hate it. I think it's a really underrated topic in the area of software development, so I just want to share my thoughts about documentation in general. Let's just dive in. I've prepared a small agenda with the topics I want to discuss with you. First, who is using your documentation? Why you need documentation? The kinds of documentation I extracted, and what to document. And finally, what is a good documentation? So the first question is, who is using your documentation? I extracted several layers of interest regarding to documentation. The first layer is the team. Your company may be interested in other aspects of the documentation than your team. And finally, the world or other partners that are working with you together. All of those are a different interest group in the area of documentation, and you also have to reflect those depending on the requirements of your target group. When you're doing changes or documentation in the green area of your team, then you can just do it because it have no effect on the other areas of the documentation. When you do changes for your company, you have to make sure that's compatible with the structure that other teams are requesting from you. And it's hard to change topics there, but you only have to discuss it inside your company. But when you have to do a change in the red area, so it's worldwide or for partners, then you have to make sure you're not breaking APIs or other aspects of your documentation that may be frustrated for your clients of using your software. So let's start with the team documentation. The team documentation contains of several steps, which I will describe briefly now in the following slides. Let's start with the pre-installation phase. In this phase, you prepare your computer in that kind that you are able to connect to the company network via VPN and prepare software that's relevant for your daily usage before you can actually start an installation. In the next step, you have the actual installation itself. All software that's needed by you can be installed then via the company network or fetched directly from the appropriate repositories. And then finally, you will have some post-installation steps that require you to authenticate or generate keys, for example, for AWS access by yourself that cannot be easily automated. Let's continue on the team documentation a little bit more. So the first information besides the installation script are snippets, I call them. These are really like text fragments of your favorite programming language or framework that you can use for doing daily regular tasks. I, for example, have snippets regularly in use when I want to boot up an Apache Spark shell with the appropriate packages I need and the executor configurations. All of those I like to have in a snippet. And I'm sure you will find something similar in your company as well. Let's now continue on the team documentation. Besides the snippets, you of course have to document the code you are writing. In general, you should apply best common software engineering patterns like describing the functions you're using good variable names, and structure your code appropriately. The next step of abstraction are the apps or the executables inside your repository. Everything that you can call directly should be documented, ideally with the input and output arguments that the application needs to run. As part of the team documentation, you of course have to document the repository where your code is belonging to itself. Make sure you write down the language you're using with the appropriate version, like for example Python 3.10. Write down which dependency management you're using, like for example pipenv or venv in the Python world. Other settings that have to be present locally to make sure that the app is running, for example .env environment variables or configuration files. Of course, that's not everything you have to put in your repository to have it full documented. Next part of interest is access for test staging and production environments. For example, if you're running integration tests on a separate server, make sure that you have access to it and are able to debug it in case of any issues. Don't forget to bring your code to production. It may sound a little bit self-explaining, but sometimes repositories are differently configured. For some you have to approve especially, and some gets automatically deployed, so you have to make sure you know how to deploy appropriate repository. Then how to execute tests. I've seen this kind of content missing. I was not aware, for example, that I have to launch Docker to make sure that my tests are all passing. When you have other secrets related to the repository with credentials or other secrets, make sure to document also where these secrets can be found and how to access them. And any other common questions that came up already by other clients or customers, feel free to edit them in the FAQ area of your repository documentation. Now let's go to the next step, the component documentation. First, one of the important aspects is the functional business requirements. So what business problem should your application actually solve? And by functional, I mean it have to be somehow measurable. For example, I want to have a web application that's serving my clients with a login mask, and it have to handle 10 requests per second. So make it as functional as possible, remove the non-functional requirements. Who are your stakeholders? So in case you deploy a new version or do major changes, which stakeholder have to be informed and what requirements can be given to your team from the stakeholders to make changes. Then the general architecture or the design of your application can also be mentioned here. Also, you should mention why you picked appropriate architecture and what architectures were also available but were not picked by the team and why you did that like you did. Also have an emergency plan available. So in case your application crashes on production, who is responsible for making it up and running again? Is it your team or is it in a different department? And what steps need to be done in case the application crashes and had to be restarted? And also the monitoring of the application, I would also put in the emergency plan. So what metrics are your application generating and what are thresholds that have to be considered when the application is in a bad state or out of memory running or other problems that can occur. And that's not everything. The infrastructure that your application is deployed to also have to be, of course, documented. Ideally, you use infrastructure as code approach like Ansible, or you do it with the CDK approach from AWS in case you're using it. Make sure that your infrastructure is documented in that kind as well, that it can be easily reproduced from scratch within a few moments. And finally, some pre and post processing steps in case your application is just one part of a big pipeline chain. Write down what's before you running and what's using your output for continuing with the processing. Give a schema definition of the data. What columns, in case you have tabular data, what columns have you in your data? What types are they? What typical ranges of the values are? And also give the data distribution to make sure the data is not skewed somehow and you're relying for feature generation on some features of the data that's actually not present in the data. Even though these distribution may get quickly outdated, you have at least a view when it changes and what may be issues that change the data as well. Let's continue with the world documentation. By world documentation, I mean documentation that's written for end users of APIs or other companies or partners. First can be an end user manual. And the second option can be jars or other artifacts you are publishing publicly, and other users can use those artifacts inside their own projects. Tutorials, how to use your software. And of course, public API documentations. Here I would like to go a little bit more deep inside. First, how to get access to this API. Second, where to send test requests to. How does the in and outbound data model look like? What errors can we expect from the API and how they are handled? Where to answer common questions. Who to contact in case of trouble. Are there any rate limit issues? So for example, how many requests can I send to this API in 1 minute? Do you support several versions and what are the differences of these versions? And do you plan to deprecate one of the versions? Let's sum up my thoughts with the last slide. What is good documentation? It's updated regularly and it contains several aspects of this documentation template that you've seen so far. If you like the video and want to see more, feel free to subscribe. And if you don't want to write everything by yourself, I've prepared on my GitHub account an documentation template that you can use. Feel free to reach out in case of any questions or comments. Thank you.